Erin Caffee, Alba, Texas, March 1, 2008. Terry Caffee was the pastor of the Miracle Faith Baptist Church in the small rural community of Alba, Texas. He was a loving husband to Penny and a devoted father to their 3 children, 16-year-old Erin, 13-year-old Matthew, and 8-year-old Tyler. Erin was what most people in Alba would have described as the quintessential pastor's daughter. She sang in the church choir. She worked part-time at the local Symonick. She was, by every external measure, a sweet and obedient girl in a stable, faith-centered home. In late 2007, she met Charlie Wilkinson. He was 19 years old, and Erin fell for him quickly and completely. Her parents were immediately concerned, not about the age specifically, but about the intensity of the relationship and Wilkinson's controlling nature. After a few weeks, they did what any concerned parent would do. They told their 16-year-old daughter she was too young for something this serious and that she needed to end it. To Erin, this was not parental guidance. It was a declaration of war. In the weeks that followed, Erin, Charlie Wilkinson, his 20-year-old friend Charles Wade, and Wade's 18-year-old girlfriend Bobby Johnson began to construct a plan. The goal was not to run away. It was not to simply defy her parents. The goal was to eliminate them, all of them, burn the house, collect the insurance money, and for Erin and Charlie to be together without anyone standing in their way. Erin contributed to the planning with specificity. She gave her co-conspirators the layout of her family home. She described the daily schedules of her parents and brothers. She knew which rooms people slept in, which doors could be accessed, and how the property was arranged. She was not a passive observer of the conspiracy. She was one of its architects. She chose Charlie over her family, deliberately, in advance, across multiple days of planning. In the pre-dawn hours of March 1st, Erin and Bobby Johnson sat in a getaway car outside the Caffee home and waited. Inside, at around 3 a.m., Wilkinson and Wade forced their way through the door. They entered the master bedroom. Wilkinson attacked Penny Caffee with a samurai sword, striking her with such sustained ferocity that the wounds to her neck were described in court as near decapitation. Wade opened fire on Terry Caffee, shooting him multiple times in the face, back, and arms. Terry Caffee was conscious enough, as he lay bleeding, to hear his daughter's voice. Erin had moved from the car to the doorway. When Wilkinson asked whether her father was dead, Terry heard his daughter's response. 2 words, I don't know. Wilkinson then went to the room where Matthew and Tyler slept. He shot 13-year-old Matthew in the face and stabbed him repeatedly with the sword. Wade found 8-year-old Tyler hiding in a closet and killed him with a 6-inch dagger. The attacker set the house on fire and left. Erin and Bobby were waiting. Terry Caffee was not dead. 5 gunshot wounds, severe burns, a body that should not have kept moving, and he made it 300 yards through a burning house in dark rural Texas to a neighbor's doorstep. He told the police everything. The conspiracy collapsed within hours. All 4 were in custody before the day ended. Wilkinson and Wade pleaded guilty and were sentenced to life without parole. Bobby Johnson received 40 years. Erin Caffee, in exchange for her testimony, received 2 consecutive life sentences plus 25 years. The most extraordinary chapter of this case does not belong to the crime. Terry Caffee, who lost his wife, his 2 sons, and his home, chose to forgive his daughter. From his hospital bed, as his body was still healing, he visited Erin in prison and told her that he loved her and that he forgave her. As of 2026, Erin Caffee is 33 years old at the Christina Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas. She will not be eligible for parole until she is 59. Terry has since remarried and speaks publicly about loss and radical forgiveness. The boys Erin chose Charlie over were Matthew and Tyler. Matthew was 13. Tyler was 8. If you're new here, welcome. Subscribe to Truth and Evidence Crime Cases and hit the notification bell. We cover true crime, cold cases, and the evidence behind the stories. New cases every week. You don't want to miss what's coming. Jasmine Richardson Medicine Hat, Alberta, Canada, April 23, 2006. Jasmine Richardson was 12 years old. Her family, Father Mark, Mother Deborah, and 8-year-old brother Jacob, were a normal, well-liked family in Medicine Hat, Alberta. In the spring of 2006, Jasmine connected online with Jeremy Steinke, a 23-year-old who identified publicly as a werewolf, told people he enjoyed the taste of blood, and maintained an extensive Gothic online presence. Their relationship developed on vampirefreaks.com. They built a shared fantasy world in which they were star-crossed lovers, persecuted by a society that couldn't understand them. When Mark and Deborah Richardson discovered the relationship, they grounded their 12-year-old daughter and forbade contact with a 23-year-old man who was, by legal definition, a predator. In Jasmine and Jeremy's shared narrative, this was not protection. It was oppression. Their online communication shifted. Jeremy wrote to Jasmine, "I have this plan. It begins with me killing them, and ends with me marrying you." Jasmine's reply has been quoted in coverage of this case dozens of times since the trial. She wrote, "It has to be done." A 12-year-old girl, discussing the murder of her parents, used that phrase. On the night of April 23rd, Jeremy Steinke arrived at the Richardson home, high on cocaine, in a black trench coat. He entered the master bedroom and stabbed Mark and Deborah Richardson to death. Jasmine was in the house. She went to her brother Jacob's room. The 8-year-old screamed. He begged. His 12-year-old sister plunged a knife into his chest and cut his throat. The following morning, a concerned neighbor discovered the scene. Police initially believed Jasmine was another victim. The digital trail between her and Jeremy told a different story. They were arrested less than 48 hours later in a neighboring province. A person who had given them a ride told investigators that when asked what happened, Jasmine had giggled. Her parents were dead, she said. Jasmine Richardson became the youngest person in Canadian history, charged with multiple counts of murder. Under youth justice law, she was known only as J.R. Jeremy Steinke, was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Jasmine was found guilty on all 3 counts and received the maximum youth sentence, 10 years, including 4 in a psychiatric institution. In 2016, after a decade of therapy and supervised reintegration, Jasmine Richardson was released at 22. She received a new identity. She reportedly attended university and lives anonymously in Canada. The people around her do not know who she is. As of 2026, Jasmine Richardson is in her early 30s. Her case forces a question the Canadian justice system answered one way, and the community of Medicine Hat continues to experience differently. Can a child who commits an act of this nature be truly rehabilitated? Jacob Richardson was 8 years old. He begged his sister to stop. Crystal Howell, Maggie Valley, North Carolina, February 24, 2014. Michael Howell had purchased a remote mountain cabin in Maggie Valley, North Carolina, a quiet property in the hills, intended as a fresh start. He brought his 17-year-old daughter Crystal with him. The relationship between father and daughter was strained. On the morning of February 24, 2014, while Michael was incapacitated, Crystal walked to his gun case, retrieved a shotgun, and shot him once in the head at point-blank range. Crystal Howell did not call the police. She did not flee. She dragged her father's body through the cabin, leaving a blood trail, and stuffed it into a plastic storage container. She carried the container to a shed on the property and left it there. Then she called her friends and told them she had a place to stay. Over the following month, the mountain cabin became a sustained party house. Crystal used her father's money to have his Land Cruiser repainted and fitted with a new stereo system. Friends moved in. Music played. Alcohol and drugs were constant. 30 feet away in the shed, the smell was getting worse by the day. She told her mother, who was in Georgia unaware, that her father had taken his own life. She said grief had overwhelmed her, and she had buried him in the woods herself. The story was detailed and emotionally credible. In late March, approximately 1 month after the murder, 2 friends tried to move a pinball machine into the shed. They noticed the large plastic bin. The smell was overpowering. They opened it and ran directly to the authorities. By the time police were notified, Crystal had packed her bags and fled. She was found 2 days later in Georgia. In her confession, she offered a single motive. She killed her father because he was planning to sell the family's pet pig. That was the only explanation she ever provided. Crystal Howell pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and concealing a death. In 2016, she was sentenced to a minimum of 30 years. As of 2026, Crystal Brooke Howell is incarcerated at the Anson Correctional Institution for Women in North Carolina. Her brief, tearful apology at sentencing was the only visible remorse in the public record. The month of parties that preceded it remains one of the most discussed examples of post-homicidal detachment in recent American true crime. You're watching Truth and Evidence Crime Cases. Subscribe if you haven't, and share this episode. 7 more cases to go, and the cases ahead are no less disturbing. Stay with us. Ashley Martinson, Pell Lake, Wisconsin, March 7, 2015. Online, Ashley Martinson was known as Vamp Chick, an aspiring horror writer with thousands of followers drawn to her vivid, violent fiction. Her blog featured detailed gore, demonic imagery, and characters who killed with enthusiasm that was, to her readers, clearly creative. To prosecutors, it was something else entirely. Ashley was 17 and living in Pell Lake, Wisconsin with her mother Jennifer, 40, and her stepfather Thomas Ayers, 37. Her account of life in that house, given at length in legal proceedings, was a portrait of sustained abuse. She alleged that Ayers was physically and psychologically violent, locking her in a room for days at a time, berating her constantly, and escalating in the weeks before March 7th. Her mother, she said, was passive and unwilling to intervene. The prosecution had a different picture. They had her blog. According to Ashley's account, the night began with an argument that escalated into physical violence. She reached for her stepfather's shotgun. She shot him once. As he was dying, she shot him again. When her mother came into the room, Ashley turned on her with a knife and stabbed her more than 30 times. After the killings, she went to the room where her 3 younger half-sisters, all under 10, were hiding. She did not harm them. She packed them snacks, put on a film, wrote them a note. "I'm sorry. I love you guys." She locked them in the room, called her boyfriend, and left the state. One of the girls freed herself the next morning and called 911. Ashley and her boyfriend were arrested in Indiana the following day. The trial presented 2 irreconcilable portraits. The prosecution's, a premeditated killer who romanticized violence for years and used an abuse narrative as cover for calculated murder. The defense's, a traumatized young woman who had snapped under genuine, documented threat to her life, whose dark writing was psychological survival rather than planning. The legal resolution, a plea to 2 counts of second-degree intentional homicide and a sentence of 23 years, did not resolve those questions publicly. As of 2026, Ashley Martinson is incarcerated at Taycheedah Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. She will be eligible for parole in her late 30s. What actually happened inside that house in the years before March 7th is not fully established in any public record. Her case remains genuinely contested in a way most true crime cases are not. Pauline Parker and Juliet Hulme, Christchurch, New Zealand, June 22, 1954. In the conservative, post-war city of Christchurch, New Zealand in the early 1950s, Pauline Parker and Juliet Hulme were 2 lonely, intelligent, and isolated young women who found in each other something they had found nowhere else. Pauline was 15, brooding, intense, suffocating under what she experienced as the smallness of her daily life. Juliet was 16, sophisticated, charismatic, but isolated by a childhood marked by chronic illness. When they met at school, the connection was immediate and absolute. They began building something together. They called it the Fourth World. The Fourth World was an elaborate, internally consistent shared fantasy, a celestial kingdom with its own royal family, its own theology, and its own moral framework that placed their bond above any law or obligation of ordinary society. They documented it in hundreds of diary entries, poems, and manuscripts, building it with the same creative energy that, under different circumstances, might have made them remarkable writers. The fantasy became their primary reality. Their bond became all-consuming. They came to see themselves as genuinely superior to the people around them, particularly their families, whom they viewed as dull and obstructive. Then the real world intervened. Juliet's parents announced their divorce. Juliet would be sent to South Africa. For the girls, this was apocalyptic. They devised a plan for Pauline to travel with Juliet, and the obstacle was Pauline's mother, Aurora Parker. Aurora was a kind, concerned woman who had been watching her daughter's relationship with growing alarm. She absolutely refused to allow Pauline to leave the country. In the girls' shared narrative, Aurora was not a worried parent. She was the primary antagonist of their life story. And so in their diaries, they began planning her death with the same creative engagement they had brought to their fiction. Pauline wrote, just days before the murder, "We have worked it out. We are both thrilled with the idea. Naturally, we feel a trifle nervy, but the pleasure of anticipation is great." The girls took Aurora for a walk in Victoria Park, a beautiful, secluded public space above Christchurch. Pauline had a half-brick wrapped inside an old woolen stocking. At a remote part of the path, Juliet dropped a small decorative stone. When Aurora bent to pick it up, Pauline struck her in the head with the weighted stocking. They struck her 45 times. Afterwards they ran, covered in blood, to a nearby tea kiosk, screaming that Pauline's mother had slipped and hit her head. The story was implausible within hours. The wounds were inconsistent with any fall. The murder weapon was found nearby, and police found the diaries. The trial scandalized New Zealand. 15 and 16, too young for the death penalty. They were found guilty and sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. They served 5 years each in separate institutions, released on the condition they never contact each other again. After release, Juliet Hulme moved to England, changed her name to Anne Perry, and became one of the most successful historical detective fiction writers in the English-speaking world. Her identity was exposed by journalists in 1994, around the release of Peter Jackson's film Heavenly Creatures. As of 2026, both women are in their late 80s. Pauline Parker lived quietly and reclusively after release. Anne Perry Juliet Hulme was a literary celebrity for decades. Millions of readers never knew. Aurora Parker was 45 years old. She took her daughter for a walk in a park she had every reason to trust. Haynie, Symonick, Allentown, Pennsylvania, March 15, 2015. Haynie Symonick was 14 years old and a freshman at a Catholic high school in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Secretly, she had cultivated an intense online relationship with Caleb Barnes, a 20-year-old active-duty Army soldier stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland. Their relationship existed almost entirely in digital communication, entirely hidden from her mother Cheryl. When Cheryl discovered the relationship, her response was immediate. She forbade contact and told Haynie she would report Barnes to the police and pursue statutory rape charges. In Haynie's text messages to Barnes, her mother's response became, with startling speed, a question of elimination. The investigation that followed uncovered thousands of text messages between Haynie and Barnes, one of the most complete documented records of a murder conspiracy in the modern era of true crime. Haynie wrote that she wanted her mother gone. She suggested using a knife rather than a gun to avoid noise. She sent Barnes a detailed diagram of the house. She wrote, "Just do it." She discussed methods, alibis, and disposal with a fluency that her defense team attributed to manipulation by an older man, and that Barnes's defense attributed to the calculated instincts of a teenager who had decided what she wanted. In what appears to have been an attempt by Cheryl to maintain peace, she agreed to drive Haynie and Barnes home from a concert in Scranton. As Cheryl pulled into the driveway, Barnes, in the back seat, lunged forward and began to stab her. Haynie sat in the front passenger seat and watched. Afterwards, the two drove Cheryl's car to a remote area and attempted to bury her body in a shallow, snowy grave. They returned to the house, cleaned the car with bleach, and went inside. The next morning, Haynie called the police and reported her mother missing. The thousands of text messages made the cover-up irrelevant within days. Haynie accepted a plea of guilty to first-degree murder, 35 years to life, on the condition that she testify against Barnes. She did, in a quiet and unemotional voice. Barnes was sentenced to life without parole. As of 2026, Haynie Symonick is incarcerated at SCI Muncie in Pennsylvania. She will not be eligible for parole until she is 49. Cheryl Symonick was 54 years old. She drove her daughter and her daughter's boyfriend home from a concert as an act of accommodation. The plan to kill her had been developed in text messages over months that she never saw. Sarah Johnson, Bellevue, Idaho, September 2, 2003. Alan and Diane Johnson were successful business owners in the affluent resort community of Bellevue, Idaho. By the summer of 2003, the central conflict in their home was their 16-year-old daughter Sarah's relationship with Bruno Santos, 19 years old, and someone they viewed as a bad influence. The arguments escalated daily. By the end of summer, they delivered an ultimatum: end the relationship or leave. When Sarah refused, they enrolled her in a boarding school out of state. Her departure was scheduled for the morning of September 2nd. For Sarah Johnson, that departure date was a deadline. In the pre-dawn darkness, hours before she was scheduled to leave, Sarah retrieved a high-powered Winchester hunting rifle from her father's guest house and returned to the main house. She went to her mother's bedroom first. Diane Johnson, 52, was asleep. Sarah shot her in the head. She then walked down the hallway to where her father Alan, 46, was sleeping, and shot him in the chest. She threw the rifle into the bushes outside and ran to a neighbor's house, presenting as a hysterical survivor who had heard gunshots from the shower. The story began to unravel almost immediately. No forced entry, no stolen valuables. The crime scene pointed inward. In the garbage can outside, investigators found a bloody pink bathrobe and a single discarded latex glove. The DNA was irrefutable. At trial in 2005, the jury convicted Sarah Johnson of 2 counts of first-degree murder. After 6 weeks of proceedings and 10 hours of deliberation, she was sentenced to life without parole. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Miller v. Alabama, finding mandatory life without parole for juvenile offenders unconstitutional, sent her case back for resentencing. In 2021, after a new hearing, the judge imposed the same sentence again, citing her continued lack of remorse and what he described as utter callousness. As of 2026, Sarah Johnson remains incarcerated at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. She continues to maintain her innocence. Alan and Diane Johnson did not survive the morning they were scheduled to drive their daughter to a new school. They died in the beds of a house they had built, shot by the daughter they were trying to redirect. This is Truth and Evidence, Crime Cases. We're past the halfway point. 3 more cases ahead, including the case of a daughter whose father brainwashed her into killing, a viral courtroom meme that was actually a psychiatric crisis, and a woman who faked an entire academic career before hiring hitmen. Subscribe and stay with us. Cinnamon Brown, Garden Grove, California, March 19, 1985. This case is different from every other case in this episode. In every other case, the daughter made a choice, however influenced, however compromised. In the case of Cinnamon Brown, the choice was made for her, by her father, systematically, deliberately, and over the course of months. David Brown was a charismatic and successful computer businessman in Garden Grove, California, a man who lived in a beautiful home with his 5th wife, 23-year-old Linda, and his 14-year-old daughter Cinnamon. He was, by the assessment of every expert who subsequently examined his behavior, a narcissistic sociopath with a precise capacity for manipulation. He wanted Linda dead. She had a life insurance policy worth nearly $1 million, and he was conducting an ongoing sexual relationship with Linda's own younger sister, 17-year-old Patty Bailey, who was living in the family home. He was not going to do the killing himself. For months before the murder, David Brown conducted a sustained psychological campaign against his 14-year-old daughter. He told Cinnamon that Linda was dangerous, planning to kill him. He told her she was the only one who could protect him, that it was her sacred duty as his daughter to act first. He was operating on a child who trusted him completely, who had no framework for recognizing what was being done to her. By March 1985, Cinnamon Brown was a 14-year-old girl who believed that killing her stepmother was an act of love. Following her father's detailed instructions, Cinnamon took a handgun, went to the bedroom where Linda was sleeping, and shot her twice. Linda died. David's second phase unfolded immediately. He had Cinnamon take an overdose of pills, constructing a suicide narrative. He wrote a note, He had her placed in a dog kennel in the backyard, to be discovered as a tragic, disturbed victim. The initial investigation accepted this framing entirely. Cinnamon confessed in a way that aligned with her father's construction. She was convicted of murder and sentenced to 24 years to life. David Brown collected the insurance money. One person never accepted the official story. Linda Brown's father. He pushed investigators to look more carefully. Over time, Cinnamon began carefully confiding in a probation officer and her aunt that there was more to the story. The district attorney's office arranged for Cinnamon's aunt to wear a wire during visits. In recorded conversations, the full reality came pouring out. The months of psychological manipulation, the specific instructions her father had given her, the architecture of a proxy murder conducted by a man who used his own daughter as the instrument. David Brown and Patty Bailey were arrested in 1988. The star witness at trial was Cinnamon herself. She faced the father who had turned her into a killer and told the truth. In 1990, David Brown was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Cinnamon Brown was released in 1992 after 7 years, her cooperation acknowledged. As of 2026, Cinnamon Brown is in her 50s, living under a new identity, married, with children. David Brown died in prison in 2014. His case is among the clearest documented examples of a parent weaponizing a child's love against another person. Cinnamon Brown was 14. She believed she was protecting her father. She was a victim before she was a criminal, and the evidence eventually proved it. Isabella Guzman, Aurora, Colorado, August 28, 2013. You have almost certainly seen the footage. A young woman in an orange jail jumpsuit stands in a courtroom while a judge reads murder charges. She looks at the cameras. She smiles. She tilts her head, makes expressions, appears to preen. The clip went viral across TikTok and YouTube, remixed with pop music, captioned, memed. The internet consensus formed quickly. Here was a cold and glamorous young killer who found murder amusing. The consensus was wrong. In the months before August 2013, the relationship between 18-year-old Isabella Guzman and her 47-year-old mother, Hulme Hoy, had broken down completely in their Aurora, Colorado home. Isabella had recently left the Jehovah's Witness faith she had been raised in, creating profound friction with her devout mother. The arguments grew more frequent and more hostile. Isabella threatened her mother. She spat in her face. She sent menacing emails. Hulme grew genuinely terrified of her own daughter. She told her husband Ryan Hoy she was scared. She called the police to the home in the days before the murder, trying to find a way to manage Isabella's escalating behavior. What Hulme and Ryan interpreted as willful defiance was something else entirely. Isabella was in the active, acute phase of a psychotic break, descending into paranoid schizophrenia at a speed and severity that her family had no framework for recognizing. Her reality was fracturing. The delusions replacing it were specific and terrifying. She had become convinced that the woman she called her mother was not her mother at all. An entity named Cecilia had replaced her. In Isabella's completely shattered perception of reality, killing this imposter was not a crime. It was a necessary mission to protect the world. The day of the murder, she sent her mother an email that read, "You will pay." That evening, Isabella waited until her mother went upstairs for a shower. Ryan Hoy was downstairs when he heard his wife's voice calling his name. He ran upstairs and found the bathroom door locked. He heard a struggle. He ran back to call 911. When he returned, the sounds had stopped. The door opened. Isabella walked out holding a long knife. She stared through him and walked calmly down the stairs and out of the house. Ryan Hoy pushed open the bathroom door. Hulme Hoy had been stabbed 151 times. Isabella was found the next day in a nearby parking garage. She was taken into custody without incident. The viral courtroom footage was captured shortly after. What the internet saw as calculated charisma, multiple forensic psychiatrists assessed as active psychosis. The smiling, the expressions, the apparent detachment from the gravity of the charges, these were not performance. They were symptoms. Multiple independent clinicians reached the same conclusion: severe paranoid schizophrenia. active delusions, auditory hallucinations, complete inability at the time of the crime to distinguish her fractured reality from the one that others occupied. The court accepted a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed indefinitely to the Colorado Mental Health Institute in Pueblo. In 2020, she sought off-grounds privileges, presenting as calm and self-aware. "I was not myself when I did that," she said. "I have my diagnosis under control." The request was denied. As of 2026, Isabella Guzman remains a patient at the Colorado Mental Health Institute. The viral meme is one of the most misleading images in true crime's digital history. A moment of documented psychiatric crisis, packaged as glamorous evil, and shared millions of times by people who never read the psychiatric reports. Hulme Hoy was 47 years old. She was afraid of her daughter in the days before she died. Jennifer Pan, Markham, Ontario, Canada, November 8, 2010. Han Pan and Bitcha Pan had built their lives in Canada around a deeply held set of values. They had come from Vietnam. They had worked with extraordinary discipline to establish stability in the Toronto suburb of Markham. And in their daughter Jennifer, they appeared to have the fullest possible expression of everything they had sacrificed for. Jennifer Pan was, by her own account and by the account she had carefully constructed for her parents, an award-winning competitive figure skater, an accomplished pianist, and a star pharmacology student. Han and Bitcha Pan were immensely proud. They saw in their daughter the vindication of every hardship they had endured. None of it was true. Jennifer Pan had begun failing classes in high school. The pressure of her father's expectations, which were high, specific, and non-negotiable, was more than she could manage. Rather than disclose the failures, she built a parallel academic life. She forged report cards. She filled notebooks with fabricated lecture notes. She left the house at the time a university student would leave, went to the public library or sat in a coffee shop, and returned at the time a university student would return. For nearly a decade, she maintained an elaborate fiction, living a life that existed entirely in the narrative she presented to her parents. The relationship that threatened to collapse everything was her long-term involvement with Daniel Wong, a man her parents strongly disapproved of, connected to drug activity. When they discovered that Jennifer was secretly living with Daniel's family rather than near a university campus, they brought her home and imposed conditions amounting to house arrest. Her phone, her laptop, her contact with Daniel, all removed. It was in this environment, cornered, exposed, with no remaining structure to hide behind, that Jennifer Pan arrived at the plan. She and Daniel, reconnecting covertly, agreed on what they framed as the only remaining option. They would hire people to kill her parents. The staging would be a home robbery gone wrong, a random act of violence leaving Jennifer as the sole, traumatized, entirely innocent survivor. She believed she stood to inherit approximately $500,000. 3 men were hired through a contact of Daniel's. On the night of November 8, 2010, after her father went to bed, Jennifer unlocked the front door. Just after 10 p.m., the 3 men entered. They tied Jennifer, as planned, as rehearsed. They took her parents to the basement, covered their heads with blankets, and shot them. Bitcha Pan was killed instantly. Han Pan was shot in the face and shoulder. Han Pan did not die. Shot in the face, drifting in and out of consciousness, he processed what he had heard in the final moments before unconsciousness. His daughter's voice, speaking in a friendly and familiar tone with the men as they left. Not screaming, not crying, talking to them like people she knew. He freed himself. He crawled upstairs. He escaped to a neighbor's house and called for help. When police interviewed Jennifer at the station, she performed the hysterical grieving daughter flawlessly. The story held until Han Pan woke from a medically induced coma and told investigators what he had heard. The investigation unraveled Jennifer's decade of academic deception, her secret life, and the full architecture of the plot. She and her co-conspirators were arrested. The 2014 trial was one of the most extensively covered criminal proceedings in Ontario's recent history. Jennifer Pan was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of her mother, and attempted murder in the shooting of her father. She was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. In 2023, a court granted a new trial on the first-degree murder conviction due to a legal error in the jury instructions. She remains incarcerated while that process continues. As of 2026, Jennifer Pan is held at Grand Valley Institution for Women in Ontario. Han Pan, who was shot in the face, who heard his daughter's voice as the killers left, who pulled himself upstairs and escaped, sat in that courtroom and testified against her. The pride he had felt in a daughter who had faked everything he had worked for. He told the jury what he had heard. 10 cases. 10 daughters. No single framework that fits all of them. Erin Caffee chose a boy she had known for 8 weeks over a family she had known for 16 years. Jasmine Richardson was 12, drawn into a relationship with a man a decade older who brought violence into a world that already felt too small to contain her. Howell killed her father, and then lived normally for a month, an indifference no explanation has fully accounted for. Ashley Martinson may have been a victim who became a killer, or a killer who constructed a victim narrative, and the legal resolution did not resolve that question. Pauline Parker and Juliet Hulme built a world so real to them that a mother became a villain in their own story, and they killed her with 45 blows to preserve the world they preferred. Haynie Symonick sat in the front seat and watched. Sarah Johnson had hours to change her mind and did not. Cinnamon Brown was a child whose love for her father was used as a precision instrument by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Isabella Guzman was not a killer in the sense we usually mean. She was a young woman in the grip of a psychosis so complete that her reality had been replaced by a different one, and the viral meme made her famous without anyone reading the psychiatric reports. And Jennifer Pan spent a decade building a fiction so complete that even the parents who demanded her perfection never suspected it, until the night she decided they were the problem, rather than the standard she couldn't meet. These cases are not reducible to a single moral. What they share is the fact of a broken relationship, between parent and child, between trust and reality, between who someone appeared to be and what they actually did. The parents in these cases were, most of them, doing what parents do. They were concerned about relationships moving too fast, about men too old, about school performance, about futures. In some of these cases they were right. In some they may have been wrong. In none of them did they deserve what happened. Penny Caffee, Matthew and Tyler Caffee, Mark, Deborah and Jacob Richardson, Michael Howell, Jennifer Ayers, Thomas Ayers, Aurora Parker, Cheryl Symonick, Alan and Diane Johnson, Linda Brown, Yunim I Hoy, Icha Pan. These are the names that belong at the center of this episode. I'm your host. This has been Truth and Evidence, Crime Cases. If this episode stayed with you, share it. Subscribe if you haven't. Leave a comment. Which of these 10 cases raises the hardest question for you? We'll see you on the next one. Thank you for watching Truth and Evidence, Crime Cases. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video. New cases every week. Every share puts these stories in front of more people. See you next time.